April 19th, 1775, a cold spring morning in Massachusetts. The sun had barely risen when British troops marched toward the town of Lexington. Their mission? To seize hidden weapons and arrest rebel leaders. But they were not alone. Waiting for them on the village green stood a small group of colonial militia, ordinary farmers and townspeople holding muskets, determined to defend their rights. No one knows who fired the first shot, but in that instant, history changed forever. The gunfire erupted, echoing across the fields. The American Revolution had begun. To understand why these men were willing to fight and die, we need to go back to the growing tension between Britain and its American colonies. For years, the colonies had been loyal to the British Crown. They traded goods, followed British laws, and lived under the rule of King George III. But over time, resentment grew. High taxes, unfair laws, and a government that refused to listen pushed the colonists toward rebellion. And now, on this day in April 1775, the anger turned into action. The British continued their march toward Concord, but the colonists were ready. From this moment on, the American colonies were on a path that would lead them to war, to revolution, and ultimately to independence.
Welcome to Chrono Whiz. Dive into history with me. Your time here will be worth it. Let's get started.
For many years, life in the American colonies was peaceful. The people lived under British rule, but enjoyed a sense of freedom. They had their own local governments and made their own decisions. But everything changed after the French and Indian War, which ended in 1763. Britain had won the war, but victory came at a price. Huge debts that needed to be paid. To recover from its war expenses, Britain looked to the American colonies for money. Parliament passed new laws that forced the colonists to pay taxes on everyday items. But there was one big problem. The colonists had no say in these decisions. They had no representatives in the British Parliament. The first major tax was the Stamp Act of 1765. This law required colonists to pay for an official stamp on paper goods, newspapers, playing cards, legal documents, things people used every day. The response was immediate. People protested in the streets, refusing to buy British goods. Some even attacked tax collectors, making them afraid to do their jobs. Britain was forced to repeal the Stamp Act, but it didn't stop there. New taxes followed. The Townshend Acts of 1767 taxed glass, paper, tea, and other imports. Colonists grew even angrier, arguing that Britain was treating them unfairly. A famous slogan spread throughout the colonies: "No taxation without representation." Then, in 1773, came the final spark, the Tea Act. This law allowed the British East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonies, bypassing local merchants. Many colonists saw this as another unfair move to control them. The response? The Boston Tea Party. On December 16, 1773, a group of colonists in Boston, known as the Sons of Liberty, boarded British ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. It was a bold act of defiance against British rule. But Britain was not going to let this go unpunished. To take control, Britain passed the Coercive Acts, also called the Intolerable Acts by the colonists. These laws closed Boston Harbor, placed Massachusetts under strict British rule, and allowed soldiers to stay in people's homes without permission. Instead of breaking the colonies, these punishments only made them stronger. The colonies began working together, preparing for what would soon become a full-scale revolution. The war had begun. After the battles of Lexington and Concord in April 1775, there was no turning back. The American colonies were now in open rebellion against the British Crown. But they had no real army, just local militias made up of farmers, tradesmen, and ordinary people. To stand a chance against the powerful British forces, They needed leadership, organization, and unity. In June 1775, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia. They made a bold decision to form the Continental Army, and they needed a strong leader. Their choice? George Washington, a respected military officer from Virginia. Washington accepted, knowing the challenges ahead. The British Army was one of the most powerful in the world, well-trained and well-equipped. The Americans, on the other hand, were inexperienced and lacked supplies. But they had something just as important: determination. One of the first major battles was the Battle of Bunker Hill in June 1775. The British attacked American positions near Boston. The colonists fought bravely, holding off 2 waves of British assaults. But they ran out of ammunition and were forced to retreat. Even though the British won, they suffered heavy losses. The battle proved that the Americans could stand up to the mighty British Army. Over the next few years, the war raged on. Battles were fought across the colonies, from New York to the Carolinas. Washington's army faced many defeats, but they refused to give up. Then, in 1777, a turning point came: the Battle of Saratoga. At Saratoga, American forces, led by General Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold, defeated a large British army. It was a crucial victory. The world took notice, especially France. Seeing that the Americans could win, France officially joined the war, sending soldiers, ships, and supplies. With France on their side, the Americans had a real chance at victory. Even with French support, the war was long and difficult. The American army suffered through brutal winters, especially at Valley Forge, where Washington's men faced starvation and disease, but their spirit remained unbroken. Then, in 1781, the final battle took place at Yorktown, Virginia. American and French forces surrounded the British Army under General Cornwallis. After weeks of fighting, Cornwallis surrendered. The war was over. The colonies had won their independence. It had been a long and painful struggle, but the dream of a new nation had become a reality. The war was won, but the real challenge was just beginning: building a country from the ground up. By the summer of 1776, the American colonies were at a crossroads. For over a year, they had been fighting the British in a bloody war. But there was a big question. Were they still fighting to be treated fairly by the British government? Or were they fighting for something bigger? The idea of complete independence was risky. It meant breaking away from Britain forever, creating their own country, and facing the full force of the British Army. But many leaders believed it was the only way forward. In June 1776, the Continental Congress, a group of representatives from the 13 colonies, met in Philadelphia to discuss this decision. They chose 5 men to draft an official statement: John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and a young Virginian named Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, a brilliant writer, was chosen to put their ideas into words. He spent days carefully writing what would become one of the most important documents in history: the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration was more than just a letter to Britain. It was a bold statement to the world. It declared that all people had natural rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It accused King George III of being a tyrant who had abused his power, and it made one thing clear: the American colonies were no longer part of Britain. They were free and independent states. On July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was officially adopted. One by one, the representatives stepped forward to sign it. John Hancock, the first to sign, wrote his name in large, bold letters, saying he wanted King George to be able to read it without his glasses. News spread quickly. In towns and cities across the colonies, the Declaration was read aloud. Crowds cheered, bells rang, and people celebrated this new vision of freedom. But while the Declaration of Independence gave them hope, it did not bring them peace. The war was far from over, and the fight for true freedom had just begun. The signers of the Declaration knew they were taking a huge risk. If the revolution failed, they could be arrested, tried for treason, and executed. But they believed in their cause. They believed in a future where people ruled themselves, not kings. And they were willing to risk everything to make that dream a reality. After years of struggle, sacrifice, and bloody battles, the American Revolution was coming to an end. The turning point came in 1781 at Yorktown, Virginia. The American and French forces, led by General George Washington and the French commander, General Rochambeau, surrounded the British Army under General Charles Cornwallis. The British were trapped. For weeks, American and French cannons pounded the British defenses. Soldiers dug trenches, moving closer and closer to enemy lines. Cornwallis realized there was no way out. On October 19th, 1781, he had no choice. He surrendered. News of the British surrender spread like wildfire. In the streets of American cities, bells rang and people celebrated. The war that had seemed impossible to win was finally over. But one final step remained: official recognition of America's independence. In 1783, 2 years after the victory at Yorktown, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain officially recognized the United States as a free and independent nation. The land stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River now belonged to the Americans. But winning the war was only the beginning. Now came the real challenge: building a new nation from scratch. The former colonies had no king, no central government, and no clear rules to unite them. Each state had its own ideas about how the country should be run. The founding fathers had to create a government that would protect the freedoms they had fought so hard for. At first, the United States was governed under the Articles of Confederation, but the system was weak. The country needed a stronger foundation. So in 1787, leaders gathered in Philadelphia to draft a new plan, the United States Constitution. This constitution established the principles of democracy, ensuring that power would belong to the people, not a king. It created a system of government with 3 branches: executive, legislative, and judicial, to balance power and protect the rights of citizens. In 1789, George Washington was elected as the first president of the United States. Under his leadership, the young nation took its first steps into the future. The revolution had ended, but the American experiment had only just begun. The American Revolution was more than just a war. It was a battle for freedom, for self-rule, and for the right to shape a new future. It was a fight not only won on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of those who dared to dream of a world without kings and tyrants. Ordinary men and women sacrificed everything so that future generations could live in a land where liberty and justice would stand above all else. From the first shots fired at Lexington and Concord to the signing of the Treaty of Paris, every moment shaped the birth of a new nation. But what was the most defining moment of the American Revolution? Was it the courage of the Minutemen? The bold words of the Declaration? The perseverance at Valley Forge? Or the final victory at Yorktown? The legacy of the Revolution lives on today. The ideals of democracy, freedom, and self-governance continue to inspire people around the world. History is more than just stories of the past. It is the foundation of our present and the guide to our future. What do you think was the most defining moment of the revolution? Let us know in the comments below.